Well, hello and welcome to another episode of The Mark Medley Show. As always, I am humbled and honored to share some of your time. Because if you're anything like me, we have some extremely busy schedules. So the fact that you would take a few minutes, 15 minutes roughly thereabouts, to take a listen to my podcast, as I said, I'm humbled and honored. As always, it is great to be with you. And tonight's episode, or today, wherever you might be, is titled, Are you willing to extend the same grace and mercy that you would like for someone to extend to you? And tonight's episode is actually going to open up with a biblical parable or a biblical story. And it's going to be from the biblical book of Matthew in chapter 18, beginning with verse 23. Actually, it's in verse 24. And what it says is, it goes into a king who wanted to settle his accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the king ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him, crying, "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged the same thing. "Please, be patient with me and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told the king everything that had happened. Then the king called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I cancel all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, the king handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. Now, I started with that story because there are many of us out here who are just like that servant. When consequences or something that really should happen to us are upon us, and then we go and ask for compassion, or we go and ask for mercy or forgiveness or pity, and then someone gives it, we ought to be grateful. But as in the story, the servant now in turn, when someone owed him something, had absolutely no compassion whatsoever. I see every day how there are grown-ups who work with children who feel as is their mission to constantly reprimand and write children up. And yet at the same time, if I as the supervisor were to now write them up for things they had not done or should have done the same way that they are writing these children up and reprimanding these children, they'd be asking for mercy. Is there any kind of way that we could have another chance? Is there any kind of way that I wouldn't receive a letter in my file this time? And yet, if a child does something that he or she doesn't like, they're quick to pull that pen and paper out. And not only is that seen in an instance such as that, but think about it in terms of when you have someone who's, say for example, a serial killer or someone who's committed murder, Don't you find it interesting? Say, for example, like in the case with the man who shot up the theater, or the one who shot up those in the street a few years back in the Washington, D.C. area. And that's just a couple of examples. But don't you find it interesting that when they're caught, they do everything they can to not have to face the consequences, whether it's life in jail, the death penalty. They will plead not guilty. They will plead insanity. Yet they've taken someone else's life. They've impacted someone else's family. They've had no compassion on those folks. And yet they are looking for a jury or a judge to now have compassion on them. They had no problem taking someone else's life, but they don't want anyone to take their life. And see, that's what this story is all about in terms of, are you willing to extend the same grace and mercy that you ask from others? In the case of this story, the servant begged the king, please be patient with me. I will pay you back. And that king had compassion and said, all right, I'll give you a break. You have an opportunity to pay me back. Now, what this servant owed the king was nowhere close to what his fellow servant or friend owed him. Because if you go back in the story, I believe he owed the king 10,000 bags of gold. And yet his friend or his fellow servant only owed him 100 silver coins. So he wasn't willing to give compassion, grace, mercy, pity for his friend for 100 coins. Yet the king now had just given him mercy and compassion for 10,000 bags of gold. There's a big difference between 10,000 bags of gold and 100 silver coins. And yet the servant with the 100 silver coins was not willing to give the same grace and mercy that had just been extended to him for a far greater debt. Now, I don't know about you, but it would seem to me that it would come to mind that when we're so focused on punishment, we're so focused on consequences, that we would think in terms of, what if it were me? What if I were in that situation? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying there ought not be any consequences, but I am saying there ought to be some understanding as to why some things may occur. That king had understanding for that servant whenever he said, please be patient with me, I will pay you back. The king didn't make excuses for him, but he did say, I'll give you the opportunity. Now, at the same time, this servant went out for somebody who owed him far less and was much more tough, much more hard-hearted toward his fellow servant than the king had been to him. And I guess my premise for this whole episode is we really need to reflect in terms of the golden rule, in terms of doing unto others as you would have them to do unto you, in terms of inflicting punishment and almost just getting joy out of being able to inflict punishment on someone. And if the tables were turned and it was the other way around, and now the punishment had to be inflicted upon you, I don't think you would like it as much. So are you willing to extend the same grace, the same compassion, the same mercy, the same patience for someone else that I'm sure that if you were in the situation having to be the recipient of that punishment, you would want someone to extend that to you? It's something to think about. That story is a perfect illustration. And again, it is in the chapter of Matthew in the Bible. Doesn't matter whether you believe the Bible or not. This is not about religion per se, but if you read what the story is and get the moral of the story. Whenever I was in basic training with the Air Force, I had a drill sergeant that would end every sentence with, the moral of the story is, airman. Well, the moral of the story is, you ought to be willing to have some compassion on people because you want people to have compassion on you. I'm going to emphasize again that it's not a matter of just allowing someone to run all over you. It's not saying be a doormat. It's not saying allowing anybody to just use you as a dish rag. But at the same time, give some consideration in terms of, would I want this forgiveness? Now, this is where it connects, because the same way you treat people, believe it or not, ultimately it is the same way you're going to be treated. Because if you look at the end of that story, when the king found out how the servant had treated the other servant, he now treated him that way. The same way he now threw his fellow servant in jail, the king now threw the servant who owed him in jail, and not only threw him in there, but tortured him. Threw him in jail to be tortured. So we have to give some thought in terms of what energy we put out into the world. We have to give some thought in terms of what energy we put out when we're with our fellow human beings. I'm a firm believer in the law of attraction, that we literally attract to us the energy that we put out like a magnet. In many instances, I use as an example in my office a metal file cabinet and a magnet. And the file cabinet will be representative of a human, of the person. And then I'll get the magnet and I'll draw the magnet closer and closer to the metal file cabinet. And the closer it gets, the stronger the pull is, until finally when it gets right there to the metal cabinet, it sticks to it. Well, our energy is the same way. If you're constantly putting out negative thoughts, guess what you are attracting to you? Negativity. If you're putting out positive thoughts, you're attracting positivity to you. When you are so bent on causing punishment for somebody else, guess what you're attracting back to yourself? Punishment. Again, whether you believe the Bible or not, it is a wonderful story. There are other stories like that, but I encourage you to go to a Bible and find chapter 18 in the book of Matthew and start reading at verses 21 to 35. This is another edition or another episode of The Mark Medley Show. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please, by all means, it's on social media, share it. If it's on Twitter, retweet it. If it's in Facebook, repost it. Feel free to post it on one of your friends' sites. If it's on LinkedIn, share it. Whatever social media site is on, please feel free to share the podcast. And we are distributed on all of the major podcast distributors, whether it be Apple, whether it be Google, whether it be iTunes, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, Stitcher. We are on all of them and then some. So all you have to do is Google The Mark Medley Show and it will come up. And of course, you can hear me live each Saturday morning around the world on GoBrave.org and locally in northern New Jersey on WP 88.7 FM. Give some thought to the story. Are you willing to extend the same grace and mercy that you would like for someone to extend to you?